Good morning, everyone. I'm Margaret Hyland. I've been Chief Scientist at MBIE now since early February, and I spend 4 days a week here in Wellington and the other day a week back in my permanent home, which is University of Auckland in the Faculty of Engineering. So I am an active researcher and engineer. I've titled my talk The Invisible Scientist because when I started at MBIE, what really surprised me was the number of people that were working in the part of MBIE and across MBIE who had science degrees from bachelor's up to PhD, but were clearly not working in science as a profession. And so that started me thinking about, well, how common is this phenomenon of trained scientists working outside of science? How specific or not is it to New Zealand? What does it look like globally? And what should we think about it? And so when Craig approached me about speaking at this conference with the theme of Beyond the Usual Suspects, I thought this fitted in nicely. So I'm not really thinking about the science that occurs outside of the science system, but rather the scientists who are outside of the science system. And I recognize that there are a number of young people here. Although some of the figures might look a little bit disturbing, I think my message is ultimately quite positive. Okay. So I wanted to start off just looking at some numbers. So I took this as an opportunity to do a bit of research myself into some of the labor statistics around scientists in New Zealand and elsewhere. And so each year out of our tertiary institutions, we graduate about 20,000 bachelor's, master's, postgraduate diploma, PhD students across science, engineering, and medical. So broadly, that area of science. And that represents about 38% of all graduates at those levels in New Zealand. So quite a significant proportion of our graduates specialize in these areas. So what happens to these graduates? Well, the good news is that you are likely to get a job. So this is data, this happens to be data from the University of Canterbury Graduate Destination Study, but it is consistent with the data that I've looked at, census data, and also there's a great set of data that Ministry of Education puts out on called Education Counts. And so if you are a graduate, and these are graduates who are 1 or 2 years out of their degree, you are highly likely to be employed. So this is only showing those who are not in education or not overseas, because that's the other two destinations. So over the time frame, say the first 9 years, by about 5 years, typically less than 2% of people with science degrees will be on a benefit. There will be a significant number who are overseas, about 15 to 20%, and then that increases with the increasing level of education. There's about 10% who are not in work, but are not on the benefit. And the majority will end up in professional or managerial roles. So we get jobs. And we earn reasonably well also. So this is income data for people with honors, postgraduate certificate degrees. And this is for the first 9 years after graduation. And so we've got the median for all students with that level of qualification. And science, engineering, technology graduates sit around that median. Of course, some are a little bit lower than others, but we're reasonably well around the median, and significantly higher than lower level of qualifications. So getting a qualification certainly improves your income earning potential. And the income earning potential of those with science degrees is very good. So that's the good news. But what was disturbing to me was looking into the statistics around where our graduates end up and whether they do or don't end up in a science, in a profession where they're directly using their science. This is a slightly old diagram, and it's a diagram that was produced looking at PhDs in New Zealand. But the general picture here is the same general picture you would see for bachelor's or above degrees, and not so different for data that's come out of the UK, the US, or the EU. So the broad picture is that most graduates end up outside of science. Okay? And a relatively small amount end up in jobs where they are using their science primarily. And this changes as we go through the career. So this is Australian data from their 2011 census. It's slightly more pessimistic than some of the data that I've seen out of, New Zealand data or UK data. And so what this is showing is, as a function of age, where are people with science degrees? And so this is all science degrees. And so down in the darker colors, dark green or medium green, these are people who are working in the science as a professional or as a technician. In the sort of gray-green is otherwise employed, so doing something outside of science, and up here is not working. And just most of those who are not working are either retired when it comes down to this end of the graph, or in education in this end of the graph. So most, and this is quite typical too, is that most people who graduate with a science degree go on, say a bachelor's degree, go on to 2 or 5 more years of education. Sometimes, but quite often not, that education is a second degree in an area outside of science. So we tend to go across disciplines. And so what you can see is we increase, so down here, it's only about 17%, okay, initially who get jobs directly in science. As I say, this is a little bit pessimistic. The data that I've seen in New Zealand is higher. It's around 40 to 45%, and I think some of that discrepancy is around what you define as a job in or outside of science, and the extent to which you're using your science and degree in a job, because obviously that's going to be a spectrum. So the numbers increase as the students who are studying here get their next degree and go into a job, but very quickly start to decline again as we go through the progression. And I think that's an issue, that the number of jobs in a science career where you can start with a bachelor's and progress through that career to senior levels is very limited. And so instead, what people tend to do is move out of the science and into other areas. And the other thing that I wanted to comment about this is that although these numbers look a little bit disturbing, I think we can take some positives out of it. There have been studies that show that students who choose to go into to study science, more than half of them don't really have a fixed idea of where they want to go afterwards. So those ideas change and develop as they get their first degree and as they move on to into their second degree. So it's not as though you have a big group of people who really have their hearts set on devoting their lives to science. Okay? So not everybody is disappointed by not getting a science degree. As I said, I think there's a limitation, this is my hypothesis, but in the ability to progress in a career where science is the focus, that actually we have to look at how we cross disciplines if we want to progress. And these people, as I say, if they're not working in science, they are working, and they're often working in professions. So they're still using their brains. So what do those scientists, trained scientists, end up doing if they're not working in a science-related job? So this is a little snapshot that I took from Science Alumni from a New Zealand university. So this covers a huge range of ages, and I just pulled out a number of different occupations that the non-scientists registered as their occupations. So you can see a huge range of things here, but there are a few common things. Business is definitely one area. Marketing, accounting, administration, and there are a number who work in roles in science organizations, but not necessarily doing science. So people in our research offices, for example, or who might be managing or project managing a science program, or like my colleagues in MBIE, who are doing either science policy or administering science investments. And in the UK, the Science Council acknowledges this range of disciplines which science graduates will end up in. And so these are, they've called it 10 different types of scientists. So you can see a number of the scientists who are what we would consider in a science-related occupation. Oops. So we've got the investigator, the explorer, the developer, and the service provider. So these are our sort of research people. These are the people who might help translate the science. Here we've got the more technical kind of roles. And then we've got the blends of science and communication, and the communicator. We've got the professionals, teachers, policymakers, so not only policymakers in science and innovation, but across government, and regulators. But looking at this and looking at the list of the various roles that our science alumni do, also made me think about, well, where aren't they represented? And there are a number of areas, I think. Although we have communicators, we don't necessarily have journalists science-trained journalists who are reporting outside of journalism, outside of science communication necessarily. Politicians, so the recent count that I've seen is we have 15 out of 119 of our MPs have a science background. What about artists? People actually running companies, so what's the proportion? And I don't know the data, but I don't know all of the data, but typically company directors are lawyers and accountants, some engineers. So do we want to see more company directors with science backgrounds and more in Māori enterprises and so on? And the other element about, of course, are scientists who are not working in science disciplines is that they are still citizens, voters, parents, taxpayers, and volunteers. And that's sort of, I want to touch on this a little bit more when we think about then the role of these non-scientists, those people that I confess have been kind of invisible to me, and I expect invisible to many of us who are working in science. So what do we think about them? So what do we think about this transition from the lab into the professions outside of science? And should we be disturbed by that? My basic premise now is no, we shouldn't at all. It might be disappointing for young scientists who have a real passion for their science and who find it difficult to get a satisfying job which has a good career prospect. That part is sad. But as I say, there are a large proportion of students who enter science not with a fixed idea about where their science is going to take them. And our scientists who've transitioned have developed a great set of multidisciplinary skills. Often these scientists are still using many of the transferable skills that they developed. So the analytical thinking is something that in surveys of science graduates who are working outside of science that comment the analytical skills, project management skills, some of the report writing skills. So they're still using some of the knowledge which they gained in a university education, not necessarily all of the science that they did. There are a group of people who have had to, more than many of us who work in the science professions, they've had to kind of cross that boundary between science and society and understand that nexus and the relationship more than many of us between science and society. And they're a significant proportion of our working population. And I think we need to start thinking about them more and thinking about them more as a resource. And I think about that for a number of reasons. One is, kind of as has been touched on already, there are a number of challenges that are facing New Zealand and the planet. So climate change is one thing that has been mentioned already. How are we going to address that? There's a number of new technologies, so genetic modification technologies are listed here, artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, synthetic biology. So all of these are technologies which are an opportunity and a risk. They also, our world is also getting more complex, and the roles that are needed are not simple single discipline roles. So we need people with those cross-disciplinary skills. But we also need those people who are science trained but working outside of science to help us negotiate some of these issues. To help us both in terms of being directly the people who might pass laws around these things, or develop the policy around these things, or develop the businesses that might use these. So they're an important group there. And I think they're also an important group for helping have a wider and well-informed public discussion about these issues. And I don't mean to imply by that if we can simply explain these technologies, then all will be well and everyone will buy into it. I think that's a very arrogant approach, and it's a very narrow-minded approach, and it's simply wrong. But our science-trained non-scientists have a role in helping to both understand some of the subtleties and the nuances around these technologies, so that the science discussion plays an equally important role in the debate alongside of social issues, economic issues, legal issues, political issues. So it's about kind of bringing that debate to the forefront in a full sense that also is science informed. And the other point that I want to make about this group is that we're in an age where experts are viewed suspiciously, and perhaps rightly so. Our invisible scientists, the scientists who are working outside of science, don't necessarily have that label, and have had to, in making that transition, think more probably about how science interacts with society than many of us who work inside of science. So they may be a more trusted in terms of being able to communicate some of these issues. So the challenge then, and I'm looking at associations like the New Zealand Association of Scientists, like the Royal Society, and others, is how do we engage this group? Because they do need to be engaged, and they need to stay engaged. So many, will do their biology degree and then move on into something else and not necessarily connect back, and then I think we lose something. So how do we keep them engaged? How do we keep them viewing themselves still as scientists, even though they may be working outside of science? What's our outreach to that group look like? So when we do outreach, and Curious Minds was talked about, our National Science Challenges all have to do outreach, our Centers of Research Excellence all do outreach, the CRIs do outreach. Does anybody think about this particular group as an outreach group, and how might we be effective in that? And I think we do have to think about how we educate our scientists. I think our education does have to somewhat better reflect what the real career outcomes of scientists will be. And I think that we can do that in a way that doesn't necessarily compromise the technical learning. But at the moment, we fill them full of stuff about, how to titrate in pipettes and mathematical models, but we don't necessarily put that in a societal context, and I think we have to start doing that. So that ends what I wanted to say. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm really happy to take questions.
Good.
Right.
Hi Margaret, James Hutchinson. Hey, really interesting talk. Thanks for the analysis. I think probably one thing that strikes me is that we probably need to move away from this idea that if we move out of the lab, that all of a sudden we're a non-scientist.
Exactly.
So I think this kind of stigma that's associated with this sort of black and white, right to get the lab, suddenly you're out of the club. I think that's probably not something as a community that we need to kind of work around. And I think your stats really highlight that there's so many people out in the wider world that are scientifically trained, understand the value of the experimental process and scientific evidence in informing and making the world better versus fake news, etc., etc.
Exactly.
That actually they're our kind of insurgents, they're our champions. They can actually help to get our message out there. And it feeds back into the whole impact thing that Craig was talking about earlier. That these are the people that can actually help us to translate that core science into that impact that we're trying to see, that we can demonstrate how our science is adding value.
Right.
So I think that's probably one thing. In terms of the education, I think we probably need to be thinking a bit more constructively around things like PhD programs and how we're actually building more professional development and transferable skills into research programs so that our researchers are better equipped to actually make that transition if they need to when they get to it, but actually celebrate the people that are going out and doing other things.
Absolutely, that's right. I think your last point is exactly right. How do we celebrate the other things that they're doing? You know, if I and where I first started thinking about this, because I'm in engineering, is how engineers and lawyers are viewed. So, you know, it's the same issue really, is that lawyers, many people who train to be either lawyers or engineers end up ultimately outside of that, and that is in no way seen as a bad thing. It's encouraged and celebrated, and yet if you ask them what do they tell you they're a lawyer or they tell you they're an engineer. So how do you get that kind of association retained? Yeah, thanks.
Just from a secondary school perspective, 15 years in the classroom as a teacher, not as a student.
Are folks at the back hearing this, or should I give Chris?
I'll use my teacher voice.
Yes.
So, I spent 15 years in the secondary classroom, and I'd just like to pick up on your comments that you're saying students are going into science not really knowing where it will lead. The flip side of that I saw was that a lot of students finish secondary school knowing very well what they would like to do. It might not be realistic. And so their plans changed somewhere between leaving school and leaving university. And I was a classic example of that. I was going to be a vet. I was always going to be a vet. I had no alternative career path. I wasn't good enough, or I didn't work hard enough. Maybe a combination of both. I ended up with a PhD in biochem, which wasn't really useful. Wasn't interested in working in a lab for the rest of my life. I hated it. It was boring. So I ended up teaching, which is a pretty common career path for vets before. But I think there's a lot of students that still come out of high school with an idea that they're going to be doctors, they're going to be vets, they're going to be, engineers, and they get to tertiary, and it's just not for them for a variety of reasons, and they end up with some sort of science degree, but don't end up in the career that they originally planned to be in. And I think it's there needs to be a better connect between the industry and the education sector, and career education needs to be a bit more robust and a greater variety. And I think it goes back even further, and I'll talk about it this afternoon, but way back in primary school we need to normalise science more. It's not a specialist, it's not just for the clever kids, it's actually it's for everyone, and that scientific literacy, which could result in a science degree that people actually set out to get in order to be a better company director, or in order to, not specifically to work in a lab, but
That's right.
be better citizens to think like science.
That kind of the contribution that your science background gives you outside of science, and I think your point about students having unrealistic expectations. Well, it's part of it is. I think it's part of what university education should be about. It's kind of about finding yourself and finding what you do enjoy and what you don't enjoy, and and I think we keep learning that as we go through our career. If I think about myself, I actually started out as a chemist, and now think of myself more as an engineer, and even and more recently moving into sort of government, even though for a short term in policy. So it always progresses, I think.
Just one more question, I think. Did you have a question?
Just coming off what...
Shout.
Just coming off what she said, science is easily transferable to any other subject anyway, and I guess science is for anyone who cares. I guess it's really, really a base subject, and teaching it sort of as one. Way back in primary school, I never had much contact with science. Or I saw it as quite an unrealistic thing until high school, and it just kind of seemed weird that I wasn't taught a lot of the basics of science. You know?
Yeah, and I think that kind of comes back to really what's been touched on a number of times. It's kind of societies and how society values science, and that's also where our invisible scientists also have an important role to play if we can mobilize them and engage them in talking about the value of science to society, and that starts at primary level and even earlier.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. If you can join me in thanking Margaret again.